Hey guys, thank you for tuning in. I really wanted to make this video about the identity of Pakistan because I think it's a super important topic and one that Pakistan constantly grapples with, whether it was in the past, the present, or the future. I also think it's a nice little platform for us to kind of start with, and I'm planning on doing a few successive videos which kind of draw on this theme but also talk about the other challenges that Pakistan is facing. So when you ask people what is the biggest problem that Pakistan is facing today, often they point to a theme like health or economics or the lack of access to justice. And I think these are obviously very significant issues and very humanitarian issues that Pakistan has to deal with and will continue to deal with in the future. But what people kind of overlook maybe is a layer behind that, and something which I think permeates almost every strand and layer and stratification of Pakistani society, which is an identity crisis. I really don't think Pakistan is at ease with the country it is or what it wants to be. Now, the way this video is structured is in three parts. I first want to talk about kind of the background, then I want to talk about the academics and what they said would happen, and the third I want to talk about what actually happened and the questions that remain for Pakistan to answer. So then we come to the question of the Pakistan movement and how Pakistan came into being. So you have to remember that Pakistan was actually quite a late blossoming idea in the subcontinent. It wasn't the case that for decades or even centuries the Muslims of India had been unified behind this rallying cry for a separate Muslim nation. In fact, it was only in 1940, which is the date that Stanley Walpole gives as the final date in which Jinnah changed his mind from being kind of on the fence to concretely wanting a separate nation for the Muslims, namely Pakistan. Before then, he had been a big proponent of Hindu-Muslim unity, and for a large part of his career, he had actually been in the Congress party. But then the natural question arises, what kind of Pakistan was he fighting for, and what kind of Pakistan did he actually want? Now, this is where it gets tricky, and I really believe this is the root cause of many of the identity questions or the identity crises that Pakistan is facing today. So Jinnah himself actually said quite contradictory things to different groups. So if you look at him talking to Western educated individuals who were helping in the Pakistan movement, some of them who had been educated at Aligarh, you can find very secular sounding sound bites and tidbits from his speeches. So for example, he talks about going to temples, churches, mosques, and that's no business of the state. But equally, when he was campaigning in some of the northwestern frontier provinces and he was talking to a much more conservative, much more rural crowd, there are instances in which he talks about how Islam and Sharia will be adopted as Pakistan's legal system and common law system. Now that's a very interesting dynamic, because then do we draw the conclusion that Jinnah was being a politician to get what he wanted? And sadly, we probably will never be able to answer the question of what he himself wanted because he wasn't around long enough to forge the nation that he wanted. So for example, Nehru actually stayed around till 1965 and very much left his footprint on India, whereas Jinnah died about a year after the partition or independence of Pakistan, and therefore we don't really have much of an idea about the direction he wanted Pakistan to go in. So if you ask people why Pakistan was created, of course you're going to get a multitude of answers and a variety of responses. But I think what is clear for Jinnah is that he believed that this would be a country for Muslim refuge. He did not believe that Muslims and Hindus could live equally in a secular India or an independent India as Nehru wanted it. He came to this conclusion probably because of his personal dealings with Nehru and Gandhi, and that's the direction that he traveled in. But then the natural follow-on question from that is, what of minorities within Pakistan? So initially, the signs were that Jinnah wanted a very inclusive Pakistan. Probably the best example of this is the fact that the first law minister of Pakistan was a Hindu. He was a Dalit, and he believed that India would become a playground for the Brahmin and it would become a caste system, derived society in which he didn't want a part of it. But sadly, after 2 years, he actually handed in his resignation to the first Prime Minister of Pakistan, Liaquat Ali Khan, and said that I don't want any part of this and I'm going to go back to India. And that kind of motif has translated its way throughout Pakistan's history. It started off with a population of 20% minorities. I think the specific figure is about 23.5%. And now we're down to 3.25%. And of course, you can take into account the fact that Bangladesh left. But of course, Pakistan cannot be seen as a hospitable place for minorities. And the real reason, I think, lies in that question of identity. Is it a country for Muslim refuge? Is it a Muslim country? And if it is one of those two, what is the status of minorities? So I think even the creation of Pakistan left the country with an enormous amount of questions that go unanswered today. So let's talk briefly about what the academics thought would happen. So I'm going to allude to a professor from Oxford called Arnold Toynbee. He was an anthropologist. And he said that any post-colonial society only really has two options, and often societies have both remnants in them, or both themes in them. And Pakistan definitely has both themes in them. The first is kind of a strand of society that benefited from colonial rule and thinks that the only way to progress is to assimilate. So for example, the wealthy elites or the liberal elites wanting to become European or become British because they view that as the path to progress. And he said, Arnold Toynbee said, that on the other side of society, you're going to have those who hearken back for an independent greatness or become nostalgic about a bygone era that may or may not have been as great as they think it was, but they think that is the route to success. So that's why you have remnants and parts of Pakistani society that think that emulating 9th century or 10th century Bedouin tribes in Arabia is the way to go forward, because they think that's when Islam and that's when Muslims were great, and that's the only way to emulate greatness. And Pakistan, in a sense, is actually at that tension point in the Muslim world between the unyielding and very harsh Islam of the Western Peninsula or the Arabian Peninsula, and maybe the more yielding and the softer Islam of the Sufi Islam of the subcontinent. And of course, that's a very simplistic reduction, but in a sense, that's the way, and that's where Pakistan finds itself at this fissure and at this tension. So Pakistani society has been tugging at both ends throughout its history. Many of its dictators, many of its rulers have belonged to this Western elite, but have often played on the sentiments of a religious and conservative population to kind of whip up support. And we're going to explore that in the next section. So how exactly did it play out? Many people would say, and it's common in Pakistan to say, that if Jinnah had lived, everything would be fine. But I'm not so sure that's the case, because you have to remember a lot of the questions of identity had been left by him. What kind of nation did we want to be? What kind of nation would we be? The fact is that the debate about the role of Islam in the constitution at least took 9 years. It wasn't until 1956 that Pakistan would become known as an Islamic Republic, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Until then, the state of Islam was important but was up for debate. Would Pakistan become a secular democracy in which obviously Islamic social principles were propounded but not explicitly so by the state? Or was it going to become a fully fledged Islamic Republic? And we all know how that played out. Now, Pakistan has had 3 constitutions, and each one has kind of embellished or has kind of strengthened and solidified the role of Islam in the constitution itself. So it became clear in the 1956 constitution that there was no going back. And in fact, there's a specific line which talks about the principles of liberty, justice, equality, democracy would be supported by the state only if they correlated with those enunciated by Islam. Now, of course, that's a very confusing thing to say, because there's no such thing as one version of Islamic government. There's no ideal of Islamic government, because there have been so many iterations throughout history. And many scholars would tell you that there isn't really an explicitly laid out plan on how to form a legislature, a senate, a parliament, any of those things. It's more the case that principles have to be enacted. And of course, that leaves such a big room for debate. And as Pakistan's history has laid out, that debate has very much been had and has actually led to some very troubling consequences for the country itself. So then afterwards in 1962, Ayub Khan came in with the second constitution, and there he actually proposed the Islamic Ideology Council, which would be one of the biggest advisors to his government, but also a way of rubber stamping some of his decisions and some of his more nefarious decisions. And in fact, that's been seen in history as kind of one of the most explicit uses of religion to justify your own actions by any leader in the world. And Ayub Khan was an expert at that, because of course if you put Islam's name towards what you're doing, you kind of absolve yourself of many blames. And what's kind of the most ironic turn in history is that the socialist, atheist, very irreligious Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, when he came to power and when he enacted his 1973 constitution, his years afterwards actually led to many of the problems that we face very potently today. It's become commonplace to kind of point to Zia-ul-Haq as kind of the person who Islamicized or radicalized Pakistan, but it is very much the case that that journey started way before and was catalyzed by the ostensibly irreligious Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And Tariq Ali puts that beautifully when he says that that Pandora's box, when it was opened, can never be shut because it's a stain that gets deeper and becomes wider as Pakistan's history continues to ignore it. And unfortunately, you're facing a situation where the questions raised during Zulfikar's government are very much the questions that still could be asked today. So I hope you found this kind of introduction into what I think is Pakistan's biggest problem interesting. Of course, there are many questions that this leaves us with. For example, what is the role of minorities? What of India? Can Pakistan really define itself without alluding to India because it was spawned from it, essentially? What about culture? We've all heard of the kind of the Coke Studio songs, and we talk about how Pakistani music is amazing. But if Pakistani music is amazing and it has its roots within India, in the subcontinent, where does that leave us? Because can we really look westwards towards the Arabian Peninsula if we have much more in common with our eastern neighbors who we're constantly fighting with, who we're constantly tussling with? Those are very deep questions that I really want to explore in the upcoming videos, and I hope you enjoyed this. Do let me know if you have any agreements, disagreements, comments, whatever, in the comments below, and I'll read them and I'll reply to them. Because as I said, if you asked everyone in Pakistan what does Pakistan mean to you, you'd probably get 220 million different responses. So I hope this was a good start, and I'll see you next time.